Well, hello everybody. Good morning for those in Brazil. Good afternoon for those located in Europe. It's very good to have you all here. So welcome for this webinar on data protection regulations and the fight against COVID-19. Introducing myself, my name is José Renato, and I am a director at the Laboratory of Public Policies and Internet, LAPIN, a Brazilian think tank which informs decision makers about themes related to technology regulation. It's an enormous pleasure to establish this partnership with the Sector Dialogues, European Union and Brazil. And I would like to thank enormously the European Union Ambassador in Brazil, Mr. Ignacio Ibanez, as well as Mr. Carlos Oliveira, and Mrs. Thailise Bezerra and Maria Noelia Bairusso for their support in making this event come true. I also thank the fantastic team at LAPIN who worked hard organizing this event, Otávio Mairink, Mariane Moreira, and the fantastic Eduarda Costa. So today we will discuss the theme of utmost importance these days, which relates to how different data protection frameworks are managing the data processing activities on the fight against the spread of coronavirus. Europeans, Brazilians, and a Peruvian scholar are gathering here today to debate the issue. Our webinar will be split into two panels. The first will discuss the state of the art of data protection in both the European Union and Brazil, taking into consideration especially the new challenges posed by the pandemics. During this panel, Miriam Wimmer, a director of telecommunication services at the Brazilian Ministry of Science, Technology, Innovation and Communications, and Mr. Bruno Gencarelli, head of unit of international data flows and data protection at the European Commission, will share their thoughts on the theme. Further, the second panel will focus on the impacts of employing contact tracing technology to combat COVID-19 on citizens' data protection. To debate the issue, we will be joined by Gwendal Le Grand from the French Data Protection Authority, CNIL, Carmela Troncoso from the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, Veronica Arroyo from Access Now, and Laura Scherto, a professor at the University of Brasilia and the Brasiliense Public Institute. By the way, you can send questions by commenting both here at the Zoom chat and on our transmission on YouTube. It is a great pleasure to welcome such fantastic guest speakers and most of all to welcome all of you who are watching us here today. I will now open space for His Excellency Mr. Ignacio Ibanez, the European Union Ambassador in Brazil, to address his welcome notes for today. Thank you and enjoy the debate.
Good morning, bon dia. Thank you very much, Renato. My first word are to address my thanks to LAPIN, our partner in the organization of this event, and to the distinguished speakers for their contribution to this exchange of views. May I also congratulate and thanks my team in the European delegation, but also the Diálogos Sectoriais. I would like to record particularly the presence of Miriam Wimmer from the MCTIC, or should I say from the new Ministry of Communications, Veronica Arroyo from Access Now, Carmela Troncoso from École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, Laura Schertel from the University of Brasilia, Gwendal Le Grand from la Commission Nationale de l'Informatique et des Libertés, and of course, to my colleague at Directorate General Justice and Consumers of the European Commission, Bruno Gencarelli. To all of you, thank you very much. Since 2016, the European Union is engaged in exchange of views with Brazil on the important matter of personal data protection, involving legislative bodies, but also President's Office, Ministry of External Relations, and Ministry of Economy, as well as civil society groups and think tanks interested in this topic. The Brazilian legislation on personal data protection is a very important development, and the fact that both chambers of the Congress unanimously approved in 2018 is an indication of the consensus reached by the Brazilian society on this matter. Brazil joined the list of countries that have modern legislation addressing the relevant aspects of personal data protection in the private as well as the public sector. The widespread adoption of digital technologies makes that almost every single aspect of our daily lives involves the collection of data. The ongoing COVID crisis, with the generalization of telework and digital communication, only further reinforce this trend. For the European Union side, 2 years have passed since the entry into force of the EU General Data Protection Regulation. In Brazil, the entry into force of the Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados is expected in the coming months, and the establishment of the Agência Nacional de Proteção de Dados appears to be imminent. This is why we found that it's the proper moment for both the European Union and Brazil to share ideas and experiences on personal data protection, especially in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. Beyond the civilization aspect of data protection, our data are part of our identity and citizenship, there is also an important economic dimension resulting from the development of data economy, a topic that shaped the recent 11th edition of our EU-Brazil dialogue on digital economy. I hope this webinar, with the participation of a group of reference speakers and recognized experts, will be one more step towards convergent views on the important theme of personal data protection. Many thanks. Muito obrigado.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. It was an enormous pleasure to hear your kind words. The European General Data Protection Regulation has certainly been an inspiration for the Brazilian Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados, and it is amazing to host this event side by side with the European Union delegation. I will now give floor to my colleague, Alexandra Krastins, to address our first panel. So, Alexandra, you have the word.
Hello, I'm Alexandra. I'm advisor at LAPIN, and I'm very happy to join this event today and present the first panel about the general situation of the data protection in Europe and in Brazil, with such a great privacy professionals as Mrs. Miriam Wimmer and Mr. Bruno Gencarelli. Mrs. Wimmer is the head of unit of the Department of Telecommunications of the former Ministry of Science, Technology, Innovation and Communication. And Mr. Bruno Gencarelli is the head of unit for international data flows from DG Justice in the European Commission. You both may speak for 10 minutes, and I'll let you know when there's only 1 minute left. I remind everyone that you may send us questions through our Zoom chat and if our YouTube channel is working. And we will select one question per speaker to answer after their speeches. So I would like to start Mrs. Wimmer. Mrs. Wimmer, thanks for your presence. And we'd be delighted if you could talk to us about the increasing relevance of data protection in Brazil and about the Brazilian General Data Protection Law.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much, Alexandra, for the introduction. I'd like to begin by greeting the distinguished speakers who are participating in this webinar, and to thank our friends at the European Commission, and also Alexandra, José Renato, Thiago, Otávio Mairink, and the whole team at LAPIN for the very kind invitation to take part in this important debate. I was asked to say a few words about the situation of data protection in Brazil. So let me begin by noting, as also mentioned by Ambassador Ibanez, that Brazil took an important step in approving a general data protection law in 2018, aligned with international best practices and quite similar to the European GDPR. As many of you know, this law was approved after a very long period of debates within government and also in National Congress, and was later, a few months later, complemented by a provisional measure issued in December 2018. Speaking from the perspective of the former Ministry of Science, Technology, Innovation and Communication, let me just make a side note here that some of you may not be aware that yesterday the ministry was divided into two ministries. So now we have the Ministry of Communications and the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation. But speaking from the perspective of the former Ministry of Science, Technology, Innovation and Communication, I can mention that the issue of personal data protection has always been understood as a central part of a strategy to promote digital transformation of the country, including both digital transformation of government and of the economy. It's clear that as digital technologies transform our economies, our governments, and our societies, and as we progressively move towards a data-driven economy, it becomes more and more necessary to develop and implement robust policies to enhance trust from citizens and consumers as to how their personal data is handled. In this sense, our LGPD is certainly a vital aspect of our legal framework, since it deals with the collection, storage, and use of personal data in a horizontal manner and applies to all sectors of the economy as well as to government at federal, state, and municipal levels. The aim of the Brazilian law has always been to provide greater consistency and uniformity in terms of how individuals exercise their rights and how organizations, public and private organizations, deal with privacy and personal data protection in the country. As you know, the law has not yet entered into force, but current discussions seem to indicate that this will happen in different stages, with the possibility of applying administrative fines and penalties only as of August 2021. In parallel, it's important to state that the provisions that refer to the creation of the National Data Protection Authority, ANPD, have been legally enforceable since the enactment of Provisional Measure 869 in December 2018, which was later converted into Law Number 13853. However, unfortunately, although ANPD exists in law, it has not yet been actually created, in fact, since it's still necessary to issue a presidential decree to establish its composition and function and to nominate its directors. The absence of a data protection authority in Brazil is certainly an aspect that creates several difficulties, especially during the COVID-19 emergency. As you know, the Brazilian LGPD is a very broad law based on principles, and it's necessary to issue further regulation in order to bring clarity as to how the law should be applied and interpreted in all these different sectors to which it applies. In fact, the absence of the National Data Protection Authority is one of the points that have been raised by those who propose that the entry into force of the law should be further postponed. On the other hand, although the law is not yet effective, it would be incorrect to state that there is no protection for personal data in Brazil. In fact, there are currently several laws covering different aspects of personal data protection in a fragmented or sector-specific manner, dealing, for instance, with financial services, telecommunications, healthcare, and consumer protection. Also, the Brazilian Constitution provides a general level of protection, explicitly recognizing the fundamental right to privacy and establishing instruments such as the habeas data. This is, in fact, one of the challenges we will face when the law comes into force and when our DPA is finally created. In fact, since enforcement has until now been exercised by a large number of national and local authorities and agencies based on different laws, including the national consumers. Just a minute, please. Sorry about that. As I was saying, since enforcement has until now been exercised by a very large number of national and local authorities and agencies based on many different legal instruments, including the National Consumers Defense System, public prosecutors, and the judiciary branch, it's clear that a huge challenge will be to provide coordination and consistency in interpreting and applying legislation related to personal data protection. Finally, at this point in time, we have an additional challenge which refers to the COVID-19 pandemic. The sanitary emergency has created a dramatic increase in the need for data processing and data sharing, both between governmental agencies and also between the government and the private sector. In parallel, in Brazil, as in Europe and as in other countries, several initiatives have been discussed and to a certain extent adopted regarding the use of technology to monitor and contain the spread of the virus, such as heat maps and contact tracing apps. But increased data sharing is necessary not only to combat the virus, but also to enable the continuity of regular activities within government. It's fair to say that this increased need for data sharing and the measures adopted by federal and local governments to spread the dissemination of the virus have raised many questions as to what is in fact admissible and what is not. I realize that this is true also in Europe, where we have seen intense activity by DPAs and by the European Data Protection Board in issuing guidance as to the best manner in which to deal with these issues. Here in Brazil, the lack of clarity as to which rules apply and the absence of guidance from a DPA have produced an important side effect, which is an increased reliance on courts and on judicial means to address these uncertainties. In fact, many of the measures I mentioned, such as heat maps and contact tracing apps, have been challenged in courts. And one of these lawsuits has, in fact, resulted in a landmark decision by the Brazilian Supreme Court, in which a fundamental right to personal data protection was recognized. The case involved a provisional measure that determined the telecom companies should share subscribers' data, their names, phone numbers, and addresses with our National Statistics Office, IBGE, in order to enable them to carry out the national census through telephone interviews. However, by 10 votes to 1, a very expressive majority, the Brazilian Supreme Court ruled that the provisional measure should be suspended and recognized the protection of personal data as an autonomous fundamental right, similarly to the European Union. There is no question that this ruling will have very far-reaching implications as to how we deal with personal data protection in the country, and also with regard to the possibilities of data sharing within government. To conclude these brief remarks, I'd like to express my hopes that as we face this terrible pandemic, we will also have the opportunity to deepen our discussions and our understanding of the importance of personal data protection legislation and of which institutions and policies we need in this field. I also express my wishes that we may continue to cooperate and share experiences with our European counterparts in this regard as we move forward towards rebuilding our economies after the pandemic has passed. Thank you very much for the opportunity of speaking today, and I look forward to listening to the debate.
Thank you, Miriam. Now, Mr. Gencarelli, we would like to hear from you about the data protection situation in Europe. Maybe you could let us know, considering your professional experience, what are the main achievements and still remaining challenges for the European Union, especially now that GDPR is 2 years old.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, very good.
Okay, yes.
Okay. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be back in Brazil, even if only virtually, and to know that so many colleagues and friends are online. Pleasure, of course, to share this panel with Miriam. I was actually in Brasilia and Rio almost 1 year ago, and I have excellent memories of my stay and of my meetings with members of Congress, with representative of the administration, civil society, business. A big thank you to the organizer for the invitation. Big thank you also to our ambassador, Ambassador Ibanez, the EU ambassador to Brazil, who has become part of the data protection family. I think that one of his first appearance in the Brazilian Congress was precisely on a data protection related matter. Data protection is an area where the cooperation between Brazil and the EU is very good. I would say extremely good, and where we have a great potential for an even deeper and a mutual beneficial relationship that can bring very tangible benefits to our citizens and businesses alike. This is an area where we clearly share the same values, starting from a constitutional framework, and our respective constitutional framework, as Miriam has explained, and we share a common vision regarding the opportunities and challenges around the use of personal data, the need to have common and robust rules of the game, putting people at the center of the regulation of our regulatory approach in the digital economy, while ensuring that business can make the most of the digital transformation. We often say that this is a question of fundamental right. This is a democratic imperative. We have seen how mishandling of data can impact the very functioning of our democracy, the electoral process, etc. And it's also an economic necessity. You cannot have a sustainable growth of our increasingly data-driven economy without the trust of consumers in the way that data is handled. In Europe, we are certainly seeing the positive effects of the choice, and we will publish on the 24th of June a report on the lesson learned during those first 2 years of application of the GDPR. Of course, this is work in progress. There's still work to be done, or there is unfinished work, but we are seeing clear benefits that can already be identified when it comes to our citizens, our businesses, and also from a governance point of view. And that's where the question of this terrible pandemic becomes relevant. The pandemic, of course, not only for the GDPR, for many legislative or regulatory tool, has been a sort of test case. And we can ask ourselves, what does the pandemic tell us about how these rules function? In other words, did the GDPR or other privacy laws pass the test of COVID-19? I would answer positively to that question, and at least for three reasons, and some which have already been mentioned by Miriam. The first one is more for consideration. This is actually the first time that we see globally that the necessity of a baseline privacy legislation, the benefits of a privacy framework, is recognized not as a result of a scandal, as we've seen with Snowden, with Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, or with massive data breaches, but as part of the solution, if I may say. By that I mean as an essential element, an essential condition to ensure the social acceptance, the uptake, and therefore the effectiveness of data-driven solutions that have been introduced to monitor and contain the spread of the virus, to calibrate public policy countermeasures, to assist patients and health diagnosis, to implement exit strategies, but also to simply ensure the continuity of government and business operation, also as we are doing right now through this video link. So that's, I think, a very big change in the privacy discourse, and it's really showing that this is a global conversation. The second interesting element is that, unfortunately, because we had to go through this, but this crisis has confirmed the validity of some of the most basic data protection principles. That in a certain senses we were all giving for granted. What I would call some key privacy design principles, such as fairness, purpose limitation, transparency, data minimization, have proved to be very relevant, pertinent to develop the digital responses I was referring to. Importance also, and that also has been mentioned by Miriam, to have a horizontal, an overarching framework that covers both the private and the public sector. Because these responses to the crisis, involve the participation of different actors and the sharing of data between different actors from the private and the public sector, you need to have a common, once again, common rules on the game. You don't want to have fragmented solution based on a fragmented regulatory framework. And the third aspect, which is worth mentioning, is the key role that independent data protection authorities play in the governance of privacy. We always thought this, and we have seen this, and this is actually one of the main lessons of our 2 years of application of the GDPR. Some observers, some commentators thought that DPAs are only about sanction, that they would transform themselves into sort of sanctioning or fine machine. Our experience, including through this crisis, indicates, I wouldn't say the opposite, because sanctions are needed to make a framework credible, but that one of the most important functions of DPA is to adapt the interpretation, application of the rules to a rapid evolving environment, to new technological, commercial, and even societal developments that clearly the legislature in Brazil or in Europe couldn't even have foreseen when those rules were developed. To ensure a consistent interpretation of the law and to avoid these legal uncertainties that Miriam was rightly mentioning. Not to leave this to the courts on a case-by cases. Of course, courts have a role to play, but data protection authorities and independent data protection authorities and well-resourced data protection authorities, because they have to be, of course, to be accepted as arbitrator, if you want. They have to be both. They have to have independent authority and to have been and they have to be well-resourced and also have a very good expertise. Really, DPAs, and I'm saying this in the context of this crisis, but also in the context of the experience we have on these 2 years of application, are the ones who, not alone, but they are an important actor in bringing life and breathing life to modern data protection rules. In the EU, we have seen in the EU, we have seen that they really had to step in to assist government and avoiding divergent interpretation between our different member states in developing those digital responses to the crisis. It has been a stress test also for DPAs. The European Data Protection Board, which is the body that brings our data protection authorities together and that ensure that consistency, is now meeting weekly. Before they used to meet once a month, meeting on a weekly basis at plenary level, many more meetings at expert level, of course, using all the digital tools, but to be able to react almost live and bring the necessary guidance. So that's, as I said, it's a major lessons of this crisis, but in general of the application of the GDPR. And the main lesson is that to a very great extent, the success or the failure of a modern privacy framework depends on the effectiveness of its governance, implementation, and enforcement system. I'm not doing that in Europe. We are doing all this perfectly. I said there's still a lot of work to be done, but it is clearly something that we have seen, we have observed, and we have experienced. And that's also why we are very much looking forward to closely work with the ANPD, the future Brazilian DPA, which is being set up. We think that this is important for all the reasons I've mentioned, but also because there is an increasing demand for international standards and cooperation in this area. And I think COVID has only increased that demand. And it's very important for us that Brazil can fully contribute to the development of those standards, to the development of this cooperation through the authoritative voice and expertise of its data protection authority. We are ourselves now putting in place what we call the Data Protection Academy to ensure that our data protection authorities can share knowledge, share experience and best practices with their foreign counterparts. And we would be, of course, very much looking forward to work with our Brazilian colleagues on this. As I said, DPA will have an increasing important role in shaping those standards, in developing cooperation. And this is also true to come back to the COVID crisis. We have developed in our various jurisdictions digital tools. These digital tools will need to be interoperable. If we want a successful exit strategy, for instance, when it comes to the lifting of travel restrictions, of travel bans, we will need our digital tools, our apps or others to talk to each other, to speak to each other, and to be interoperable. And here also privacy has a big role to play, and the contribution of the expertise, the guidance of our data protection authority will be fundamental. So as you can see, and I'm coming really to my conclusion, we will probably be very busy working together in the coming months and years. And that's how it should be if we want to address challenges and opportunities that are increasingly global in nature and scope. Muy obrigado.
I would like to thank you both for the important considerations and invite you to stay online and watch the next panel, in which you may contribute with questions at the end. And in order to keep up with the agenda, we would like to move straight to the second panel, and then we will have a final session for questions and answers for both panels. Also, I invite the audience again to participate, sending us questions for the next panel in our Zoom chat and also in our YouTube channel.
Thanks, Alessandra. Can you listen to me?
Yes.
Okay, so let's start with the second panel now. Hello, everyone. Now we are starting with the second part of this event, which will be about contact tracing apps and the COVID-19. What are their implications for data protection? So we are very thankful to have with us 4 other incredible guest speakers who are, first of all, Mr. Gwendal Le Grand, who is a Deputy Secretary General of the French Data Protection Authority, CNIL. We will also have today Mrs. Carmela Troncoso, a professor at EPFL, École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. We also have Mrs. Veronica Royo, a Policy Associate for Latin America at Access Now. And last but not least, Mrs. Laura Schertel, Professor at the University of Brasilia, UNB, and the Braziliense Institute of Public Law, IDP. So before starting, I would like just to share a procedural rule. Which speaker will be given up to 10 minutes, and then I will inform everyone. I ask your permission to interrupt saying when there's only 1 minute left. And after everyone speaks, we will have about 20 minutes for the audience questions, and then move to the conclusion of this event. So if we are all fine with that, I would like to first start this panel with Mr. Le Grand. And as the audience might be aware, the French government has recently proposed a contact tracing app called Stop COVID. And CNIL has also published a FAQ about it. So as you give it the floor, Mr. Le Grand, we would be delighted if we also had the opportunity to have a general idea of how this app works and what's CNIL's role on the app supervision.
Thiago, sorry to interrupt you. We'll have first Professor Carmela. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Thank you for telling. So we'll go first with Mr. Carmela. So introducing Professor Carmela. She will start talking and we would like to know, if possible, about the DP3T, which is an approach for contact tracing apps that use a decentralized strategy. So if you are able to tell us a bit about that, we would be glad. But feel pleased to talk whatever you would like about this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Thiago. Am I online? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Cool. So I'm here to talk about project DP3T, which stands for Decentralized Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing. And this is a project that we started some months ago with a big group of fellow scientists trying to put our little grain in the big mountain that is protected from COVID-19. And what proximity tracing tried to do is to be a complement to the traditional manual contact tracing. In manual contact tracing, the idea is that once someone is found COVID positive, a doctor would talk with them, and this person would tell them which other people they have been in contact with in the last weeks, so that these people can be called and asked to take precautions such as quarantining themselves or going for a test. But in the greater scale of COVID-19, where we have so many infected patients, doing this in a timely and scalable manner is very difficult. So the idea of proximity tracing apps is to provide a complement by being able to, using technology, notify users that have been exposed to other COVID-19 positive users, and therefore they could be at risk of infection. And apps are helping to do this in a faster manner and in a scalable manner and trying to be efficient. And the idea of our approach is to do this introduction of technology while guaranteeing privacy. And by this, I mean respecting the principles that Mr. Gencarelli said before, such as data minimization, purpose limitation, and having as much transparency in the process as possible. So how our approach works is when somebody installs one of these applications, their phone will create a key, and this key stays on the phone. And with this key, the phone creates some random identifiers, and it's just random numbers that when you see them separated, you cannot link them to each other, so you cannot track people. And each of these random identifiers is used during a limited amount of time so that people cannot be tracked in their movements given what their phone is broadcasting. So phones broadcast these numbers all the time, and when they find another phone that has the same app installed, they would listen to each other, and when they are close enough and they are able to listen to this Bluetooth, they will record this random identifier. So after some time, when you're doing this, your phone will have two different lists. One is the list of numbers that you have been broadcasting around, and the other one is the list of numbers that you have been hearing, which kind of says which encounters you have had. You don't know with whom, but you have this list. So let us assume that eventually one user has the bad luck of actually being infected by COVID-19, goes to the doctor, gets a positive test. So together with the result, the doctor will give them a code. And with this code, if so they want, of course, upon consent, users can decide to provide information to a server that helps notifying other users that maybe they have been exposed to the virus through this positive user. And what we upload to the server is the numbers that the phone has been producing. And why the numbers that the phone has produced? Because first of all, they are not connected to the identity of the owner. They are only related to this key. They are not related to the locations or to the movements that these persons have done, because they are created on a fixed schedule by this key. So they are not really connected to the user behavior, and they are not related to other people that this user has seen or this user has interacted with. Not the number, not where, not when, not whom. Is only the numbers of the phone. So we guarantee that there is no more information there. And with this information, this server cannot learn anything about this user, right? It's a list of random numbers. And then the rest of the phones in the system, they would periodically download these random numbers. And then they will check with the list of the numbers that they have seen in any of these random numbers have been seen. And then with all of the list of the numbers that they have seen, using the power of the Bluetooth signal, and you can imagine this as a person shouting, right? When you talk, the further away you are, the less loud you listen to the signal. So with this, we can more or less estimate how far they were. And if all of the numbers that you have seen, they have been close enough to you and you have been exposed to these numbers for long enough time, and the approximation that epidemiology authorities give nowadays is being for more than 15 minutes in a circle of approximately 2 meters, then yes, the app will consider that you have been exposed to the virus for long enough and show a notification to the user. In the case of Switzerland, this notification actually asks the user to call an info line, and in this info line, they may be asked for more personal information, their own situation, whether they are, what's their age is, what's their health situation, to actually make the best decision as to what's the next step, self-quarantining, going for a test, or something different. And what is very important from the data protection perspective is that this system offers privacy by design. The only information that ever leaves the phone are these random numbers that, as I said, they are not connected to any personal information, no identity, no location, and no information about others. We have built the system in such a way that not even the IPs that are used in the system can actually be linked to any health information, and there is no other information. So nothing can be abused, and there is no risk of a function creep of the system. And another very important property of building the system this way is that the system sunsets by design. And what I mean by this is that the system kind of by itself dies when people don't use it anymore, meaning that if users do not upload more numbers, so if all of the citizens of a country would uninstall the app, this server would not have any more information, and even if the country would continue the service, there would not be more data exchange. And something that is very important to understand from the data protection perspective is that at the end of the day, what I have explained right now, which is how the app works, is just a very, very small part of the puzzle. One needs to take into account that all of these things happen on a phone that has a mobile operating system. There is some law, and we need to take into account the societal impact and the societal acceptance. And this is what it is very, very important that privacy is preserved from the beginning, as it was said before, but also the transparency of the process. And right now, the latest surveys in Switzerland say that actually the app would have 70% acceptance by citizens. And we fully believe that a lot of this comes from the fact that we have been very transparent on our process. We have been for 3 months publishing documentation and explaining to the public how the application works, what data is going to be available. Even we made a very profound technical analysis of the risks, and we just explained to people where, when and where there could be an attack happening, so that they really understand what is going on, and they can trust that the system will only be used for the only purpose, which is these notifications, so that we can all together stop the spread of COVID-19. And right now, as we speak, we have the first pilot ongoing. So it's the first pilot that uses the new Google and Apple system, and it has been already ongoing for like a month, a week and a half, and which we have learned a lot about, well, how well this API of Google and Apple works, but also a lot about how citizens feel about the app. Do they understand the messages? Do they understand what's going on? And we're currently going through the last fine-tuning, so that very soon we can actually go live for the full country. And I must say that I'm very proud that for me, and I think for the full society, this is the first time that the truly privacy by design system, meaning that one that has technology that really avoids that any personal data leaves the device of the user, is not only deployed, but is deployed at larger scale, and with the support of 2 big technological giants that have known in the past to be very invasive, as Google and Apple. But right now they are actually deploying something that from a data protection and privacy perspective is one of the most protective technologies that we have ever seen. And I'll be very happy to answer any questions about the system or about our experience in Switzerland with developing, and questions that you may have about data protection and how the Swiss have approached the problem.
Thank you, Carmela. It was very delightful to know more about the protocol. It's very nice to know that there's some pilots going on. And now, as a counterpart of this approach, it would be nice to know a bit of what is the proposal of the French government. So if Mr. Gwendal could talk now, speak a little about Stop COVID and what CNIL has been doing on that, we would be very glad. So thank you.
I think it should be okay now. Can you all hear me? Sorry. So thanks a lot for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity to present the work done by the EU and by the DPB and by the French DPA on the fight against COVID in relation with personal data protection. I will focus, of course, specifically on Stop COVID, which is the French app. I know, of course, Brazil, like EU countries, has been very much impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to express my deepest sympathy to all of your compatriots that have been directly impacted by the pandemic, either directly or through their relatives. During the COVID period here in Europe, DPAs, the data protection authorities, have witnessed the same phenomenon at national and at European level, because indeed our workload and solicitations at European level have been intensifying during the pandemic, and there was a need for coordinated response to data protection challenges that has become more and more pressing. At European level, you know, we have the European Data Protection Board, which gathers data protection authorities at European level. The work has intensified and been adapted in the working methods of the board, because we started meeting remotely at least once a week at plenary level in order to provide guidance and respond swiftly to requests in relation to the COVID pandemic. There's two important facts before we dive a bit more into the technological responses and speak about the apps that are important to highlight and that were confirmed during that period of the COVID pandemic. One concerning our legal framework, and I think Bruno spoke about it already, and the other one is about the role of DPAs. On the legal framework, the common denominator of the EDPB and all national positions on these matters relies on a consistent message, which is that data protection does not impede the fight against the pandemic. Our framework is compatible with the fight against the pandemic. GDPR remains applicable and allows for an efficient response to the pandemic, while at the same time protecting fundamental rights and freedoms. It's an essential pillar. I'll go even further. I'll say it's an essential pillar to ensure the trust in a number of possibly intrusive technologies and systems. On the role of the DPAs, of data protection authorities, this period also confirms that our societies are heavily relying on digital technologies, and that all digital activities are based on personal data processing operations. And in that context, DPAs and GDPR are clearly identified by the public, by the press, by companies, by public authorities, and by politicians whenever new technologies are being envisaged. So if you look back at the questions that we received during the period, we've adopted a series of recommendations, statements, and guidelines in order to provide concrete guidance and ensure consistency in the various initiatives at European and national level involving data processing to fight COVID. The scope of processing activities addressed by the DPB in the guidance documents, which were adopted under very tight guidelines, is very broad and reflects the importance of personal data in the measures that are put in place to address the pandemic. We have contact tracing tools. I'll come back to this, but there's been guidance also on location data and mobile application, on medical research, and other important issues were also addressed, such as the use of drones that were used by authorities to check if confinement was being respected, tools to measure body temperatures, cameras to verify if people are wearing masks in public transportation, but other issues such as teleworking or remote application. So CNIL, Data Protection Authority, for instance, has put up a hub page on its website, which is tackling all the important issues related to COVID. It was in practice covered, these issues were in practice covered by a number of documents that were adopted at EDPB level. We have a statement on the processing of personal data in the context of the COVID outbreak, which was adopted shortly after the beginning of confinement. We have a statement on restrictions on data subject rights in connection to the state of emergency in member states. We have guidelines on the use of location data and contact tracing tools in the context of the outbreak. discussing also some technical guidance for the so-called centralized and decentralized approaches for the contact tracing apps. And we have guidelines on the processing of data concerning health for the purpose of scientific research. And right now we're working on the interoperability of the various apps that are being deployed at national level. In addition to that, EDPB has also answered a number of questions, because we've received a lot of letters from members of parliament or from civil society with respect to what could be done or not in compliance with the GDPR. We're, for example, working right now also on topical issues. I mentioned interoperability, and there's another guideline which is being worked on concerning processing activities related to the progressive reopening of borders within the Union. At CNIL, we also needed to adapt. We worked remotely, we adapted our working methods, we gave our opinion on a variety of topics. We gave opinions on secondary legislation, authorizing, for instance, the contact tracing application, because this application is enshrined in the decree, which is a secondary legislation in France. The French app's objective is really to inform people that they've been closed, that they've been exposed potentially to COVID, that they've been close to persons during a certain period of time, as was explained previously by the previous speaker. Once a user is diagnosed or tested as being positive, he receives a QR code by the medical professional. He will scan the QR code, and this will give reliable information that is injected inside the application and circulated in the system, so that people who have installed the applications are informed that they have potentially been exposed by that person that has been diagnosed positive. It's been launched a couple of days ago on the 2nd of June, and right now the application has been downloaded more than 1.5 million times. In France, we have 67 million people, I think. The important points that we highlighted in our opinions in the context of the Stop COVID app was, first of all, an analysis on the necessity and proportionality of the tool. So is it possible to use this type of tool in compliance with the French data protection law? One of the things that was very important, there's been a lot of debate on the number of people that actually need to install the app for the app to be efficient. And what was said by the epidemiologists was that even if a few people install the app, it has some usefulness, because it's something that complements the natural, the traditional manual contact tracing systems. What you detect mainly with the application, or the aim, is to detect that you've been exposed when you take the metro, for instance, you go in public transportation, or you go to a bar, and you don't know the people around you. With manual tracing, the idea is that you rely on the person's memory. So you will say, I've been close to that person, I know the name of that person, and I will contact that person. With the application, the objective is to be able to react quickly and be able to identify people that you don't know personally, but you've been close to them because they were using the application. So one of the things we said in the CNIL's opinion was that this application can be useful, it can be proportionate, but it has to be in the context of a global health strategy that also includes other tools. There's been a lot of discussions on this, of course. Another thing that we said in the French and also at the European level was that the most appropriate legal basis for the application was probably the public interest on the basis of the national legislation. So let me explain this very briefly. In GDPR, when you do personal data processing operations, you need to identify a legal basis. So there's a number of legal bases that are described in GDPR. It can be consent, contract, public interest, legitimate interest, and so on and so forth. So there's a number of legal bases that are being identified. And one of the things we said is that this is something that will be promoted by the governments. that has a public interest, and the most relevant legal basis is public interest. If it's public interest, it means you need to have some kind of text, law, or secondary legislation in the member state to be able to set up the system. One other option: some member states have chosen consent, but consent in GDPR has a very high bar. So some DPAs argued that if the legal basis were consent, it would be more difficult to do the promotion of the application and tell people that they need to install the application to help fight COVID. One important thing also about the overall system is the voluntary use. And we've insisted a lot on that. It's not because you have a decree that you can't have an application that is of a voluntary use. So it means in practice, I'm not forced to install the application, and I shouldn't have any negative legal effect if I refuse to use the application. What does this mean? It means I can't be forced to install the application in order to take public transportation. I can't be forced to install the application to go to work, for instance. Other characteristics of the application, well, we talked about Bluetooth already. We talked about Bluetooth already. The application is not relying on geolocation, technologies. Sorry, I had been muted. So I think one important technical characteristic of the application is also that it's relying on Bluetooth and not on GPS. So it's not geolocation, you detect proximity. You don't need to know where people have been meeting. You need to know that they've been close to each other at a certain point in time, because this may have exposed one of the persons who is using the application. Other important point, data are being pseudonymized. So we've had an explanation before about the generation of the identifier and things like that. It's not anonymous data, it's pseudonymous data that is being exchanged in the systems. Pseudonymous means that GDPR applies, but it means also that we have good security measures and good privacy by design in the applications in general. In the French system, it's what people call the so-called centralized approach, but I think that the term does not adequately reflect what is actually going on. The main characteristic in the application is that you don't send to other people the information, the identifier of the person that has been infected by COVID. You just send an information to them that they have been potentially exposed and then they need to be tested, for instance. So this was also an important privacy by design feature that we noted in the French application. We did a number of recommendations also on security, on retention periods. There was a discussion before on the fact that you don't need to retain proximity information for more than 14 days because this is related to the period during which you may contaminate other people. So this has to be, of course, built in the application. We did recommendations on improving the information when you're installing the app, especially when minors are installing the application, because you know GDPR has special safeguards concerning minors. And of course, we've given an opinion on the application before it was launched, but we also have inspections.
Sorry, 1 minute.
I have almost finished. We have given some advice before the application was launched, and we have already announced that we will be conducting inspections. So our opinions were also at the heart of the debate, of the political debate that was held at the Parliament, because when this was discussed at Parliament, basically all speakers at Parliament commented on the CNIL's opinion. So to conclude, personal data are a fundamental pillar of our digital economies. GDPR is a robust legal framework, and DPAs are the guardians of this fundamental acquis that we have in the EU for our democracies, and which is essential for sustainable digital innovation. The EU data protection authorities have clearly demonstrated their ability to react swiftly and to provide the relevant guidance, while privacy and data protection have often been at the core of the debates surrounding measures to address the COVID pandemic. So thank you very much again for your invitation and for your attention. And I will have to leave the meeting at 4:30, so I'm sorry I won't be in for the questions and answers, but I'll be happy to respond offline if you have any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Le Grand. It was very delightful to know better about the role of the DPAs, which is very important on monitoring this kind of technologies. So we are very glad to that, very thankful for your participation, even if you're not able to stay until the end of the event. Sorry for all the technical issues we had before. So now moving on, I would like to invite to the floor Mrs. Veronica Arroyo, who is involved in monitoring many initiatives going on around the Latin America and Caribbean region for Access Now. So Veronica, I will give you the room, and feel pleased to tell us a bit more of what has been going on in Latin America and Caribbean region.
Thank you very much, and so muito obrigada pelo convite de LAPIN and the European delegation in Brazil. So my presentation will cover two main parts. It's going to be very simple to understand it that way. So I will start talking about the cases in the region in Latin America, and then I will move to the privacy issue on this discussion. First of all, to understand what's going on in the region, that's very interesting. We have some ongoing initiatives, and all of them come from the government, and all of them are different. That's also very interesting for our researchers. I'm going to start with the top of the map. Honduras has it started to deploy an entire system. I would not call it contact tracing per se, but it's kind of an exposure notification issue, because every citizen that goes to a store needs to get his or her ID scanned by the store. So if it happens, sadly, that someone that went to that store tested positive for COVID, then this person will be notified. This is different from what we've been heard about, Bluetooth and all this debate on the API and things like that. Then we have Jalisco from Mexico as well. I have very little information about what's going on there, because it's an application that develops other tools, that has other tools, but also has contact tracing. This is based on GPS, and also it's a centralized system. Then we have Mexico, who has a larger story on contact tracing. But just to sum up a little bit, there is also an app called Corona app, and this app started to have many other tools, but also they decide to put some contact tracing there, and they did with software from a Portuguese company. It didn't work, so they stopped the project, but then they were saying that let's do it with the API of Apple and Google. But recently, Carisma, a local organization in Colombia, discovered after doing some testing that they are doing contact tracing and using the Blue Trace protocol, and from Singapore. Okay, another story here is the Peruvian story. We've been following this story very closely, as I am here, and we're gonna have contact tracing in the next version of the application that also has other tools again. And we saw this coming since the beginning. The privacy policy has this, the first version had it like a small paragraph telling us a little bit why they want to access to our Bluetooth. And then we have not the case of Uruguay. Uruguay is a very special case. They do have also an application there. that does other things, but they want to do contact tracing using the API of Apple and of Google. So it's very important how, you know, the region is going, and how governments are adopting technology in this pandemic. And it's very important because, you know, there are a very large debate, and a lot of papers have been written around the efficacy of contact tracing, if it's good, if it's bad, you know, if the technology works or not, does not work. A lot of analysis on necessity and proportionality principles as well. But there is something that we have to take into consideration when we talk about Latin America. And here I want to quote an activist from Honduras that said earlier this week, sometimes governments build and develop technology for a country that does not exist. What does it mean? This means that sometimes we have this tech optimism that makes us believe that, you know, technology will be here and will save us from this pandemic. And the truth is that our reality is different. We have problems on connectivity, and obviously in different levels in each country. There are problems on access to high technology, and also gaps on digital literacy. We are not an Asia region, we are not Asia countries. And also the access to technology, you know, it's different. You know, we don't have the same cell phones, at least. Obviously, another big issue is what happens when you get exposed and you get notified, you know, that you've been exposed to someone that tested positive. So obviously the next thing is you need to go to get tested, you need to go to self-quarantine, you need to do many things. And then we face this problem on how the health system is in our countries, and obviously different levels again, but it's still a problem here. So I think at this point I should stop my presentation, because you might think about why for us it's kind of complicated to think about this technology. But since I have a little more time, I want to talk a little bit on the privacy part of this discussion. So to talk about the privacy part, it's also very important to see that most of the people in Latin America will see that target surveillance is bad. You know, it's something that is not well seen, but maybe massive surveillance, it's fine. And why I'm saying it's fine, because we have seen deployments of CCTV cameras, facial recognition cameras, and all the time this comes with a narrative of we're doing this because there is this big objective at the end of the tunnel. And this big objective is public security in most of the cases. There are some exceptions, but now we're saying, let's do contact tracing because it's for public health. The problem is that inside this narratives, what we have is safety, and safety is very connected to our human existence in this world. So it's very normal that people privilege their safety sometimes and decide just to forgive a little bit on the privacy part. And in this context, how we can believe and how we can brainstorm or think about privacy. So it's a challenge for us as policymakers, for policymakers and us as policy analysts to understand and to see how we can continue this working on privacy when safety is there. There in the context. So in the case of privacy, I want to focus a little bit more on centralized approaches, because those are the ones that we have in the region, and that the only exception is the Uruguay case. And the biggest risks for sure is the first one is the central servers, because they are managed by the government, and in some of the cases there is no even data protection regulation. That's the case of Honduras, or maybe the data protection is kind of 10 years old, so has not been important updates. And also this is this reflects in clashes with all the transparency problems that we have. So if we don't know what's going on in the application and what the government is doing, how we're going to enforce a law that we have. That's the case of Colombia and Peru that both have data protection legislations. we need more transparency to understand what's happening inside the application. Also, this influences obviously the privacy policies of the apps. And up until now, well, the only positive thing is that at least the privacy policy for the app in Peru has this sunset clause that every data will be deleted after the state of emergency ends. That is great, but we have not seen anything similar in Colombia nor in Uruguay. Then another worry is for us is the kind of data that will be transferred from the cell phone of the user, of the citizen, to the central server. And here's a problem because it's not just, as I'm saying, it's not just an application, a contact tracing application. It is an application that has many other tools. And every time that the user, at the moment you download the application, you have to register yourself to use the application. In the case of Honduras, it's mandatory to have the application. In the case of Uruguay, Colombia, and Peru, you have to register yourself, and obviously you give personal information there. You have the auto test option, so they also gather and collect health information, or at least information about how you're feeling, and if you've been in contact with people that might have to test positive. So all this information about a person might be mixed with the contact tracing, and we know it's going to be keys, that maybe it's going to be encrypted. We don't know that, but there is obviously a worry there because we don't know how they will handle all this data, and it's too much data. And I don't want to take more time to talk about if tech companies are involved in this in the development of the app, or if they are going to use an encrypted keys to preserve the security of the information. And we don't know if I don't know, we don't have enough information to build arguments around if beacons can be a problem on the system. But for sure, what we need audits. We need the possibility to audit the system, to audit the application, and that's very, very important. Just until now, we just only heard that the Uruguay government wants to make the code public. And also from our conversation with the government in Peru, they say that we'll do that as well. So we really, really hope this can happen, so we can make audits on the technology. And this is very important for us, and this is just to finish, because there is a risk if we don't do the things correctly, because we can create false sense of security, and people will feel more free to go on the streets. And that obviously poses more risks. And also we can create more panic, and we can create discrimination. So we really need very strict rules and very, very concrete things here, and not just an application that comes with as an advertisement. We published some weeks ago, our do's and don'ts on contact tracing. We sent this to the Peruvian government, and they listened to us. I mean, we had a conversation with them due to this do's and don'ts. And as my last message here is, we are going to be very vigilant, because we don't want that this pandemic is used or can be used to build a surveillance system when it's over. We don't want this to be an excuse for governments to start thinking that the use of massive technologies is fine. And now I'm happy to listen to the questions, and thank you very much again.
Thanks, Veronica. Thanks for reminding us that not every solution may work in every country in the world, and socioeconomic context should always be taken into consideration. And well, last but not least, we will now have the opportunity to hear from Mrs. Laura Schertel about the current situation in Brazil. So, Professor Schertel, please feel free to start.
Thank you very much, Thiago. I would like to begin thanking LAPIN and the European delegation for this kind invitation. As the COVID-19 pandemic expanded across the world, so did the debates on whether fighting the sanitary emergency would require the use of personal data and on how that would impact pre-established data protection frameworks. In Brazil, these concerns first came to light with the announcement of agreements between state government and telco companies, which would allow use of personal data to enforce isolation policies. There isn't a central contact tracing app being used in the country up to now. Since Brazil doesn't have an adequate volume of tests, the effectiveness of such an app would surely be a big issue, along with privacy, security, and equity issues. There are already some symptom apps used by universities and research centers, as well as by governments in the state level. The main problems of such apps are, on my view, that purpose and sharing limitations are not clearly established. Another issue relies on the legal ground of data processing. Since the main legal ground is consent, one must be sure that it is freely given, and that is not always true. I'll mention one example of an app used by a project from the University of Brasília called Guardiões da Saúde, Vigilância Participativa, which asks for students and professors to fill questions regarding their health status in exchange for university credits, without informing exactly the purpose of the data protection. Even though a modern data protection law was approved in 2018, the Brazilian landscape is particularly threatened by its recent postponement to 2021 and the lack of a data protection authority. Overall, this results in an institutional environment mostly defined by blurred competences and legal uncertainty. Despite the concerns of even further setbacks for data protection, the country reached an important milestone as the Supreme Court ruled on the unconstitutionality of a legal provision that mandated personal data sharing for statistics purposes as an emergency measure. As Miriam Wiemer already mentioned, the Executive Order 954 was contested by different political parties and the Federal Bar Association. And this executive order obliged telecom operators to share with the Brazilian Institute for Geography and Statistics, IBGE, personal data of more than 140 million mobile service users, including names, cell phones, numbers, and addresses. The data sharing was claimed to be essential in order to allow individual interviews for the development of relevant national statistics, and the reasoning behind it was the impossibility of IBGE staff to visit households in person during the pandemic. The executive order has been contested both on the grounds of procedure and substance. As per the substance, they claimed that it did not abide by fundamental legitimacy standards, such as purpose limitation and transparency, since it did not provide the exact reasons the data were needed and the means through which they would be used. Also, it was claimed that the legal provision failed to address proportionality, as the amount of data required was neither clearly justified nor accompanied by security measures towards risk of breaches or misuse. In this sense, the measure did not comply with the minimum use principle, according to which the use of data should be restricted to the amount strictly necessary for its purposes. By the vast majority of 10 out of 11 justices, the Brazilian Supreme Court held the executive order unconstitutional and declared its invalidity. Data protection had already been applied by a few other higher courts' decisions, but this trial is a milestone for the country's framework because the Supreme Court has now validated the constitutional fundamental rights status of data protection. Among other things, this means that future legislation and administrative acts are bound by principles such as purpose limitation, proportionality, and transparency. Above all, the decision allows the judicial review of ordinary legislation regarding this new recognized fundamental right. Among other arguments, three central ideas that base the court's reasoning came into the spotlight: the need for protection beyond intimate data, the recognition of data protection as a fundamental right, and the limitations of the country's current institutional framework. The court ruled that data protection is grounded in different constitutional protections of the individuals, such as privacy and due process related guarantees, and therefore holds a fundamental right status. In fact, different justices have expressly extracted this construction from both the German right to information self-determination and Article 8 of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. Besides settling this specific dispute, the Supreme Court endorsed years of debate and initiatives towards the enhancement of data protection regulation. In a time when data protection measures were already being underrated for the alleged sake of public health, this decision establishes present and future guidelines of data use in purpose limitation, proportionality, and the active adoption of information security measures. Furthermore, the decision establishes relevant boundaries for the executive and legislative branches, which were not clear in the Brazilian landscape yet. Even though this decision does not neutralize all the current risks for data protection in the country, it does state an important precedent for lower courts. As adjudication will possibly continue to play an important role in containing initiatives such as the executive order, only the creation of a data protection authority with its multi-stakeholder council would bring more legal certainty for data processing in Brazil. Nevertheless, the ruling already provides for clear constitutional standards for legitimate data processing. Hopefully, it will also clear the path for the full implementation of the data protection framework designed in the LGPD. So I'm here for questions, and thank you very much again for this kind invitation from LAPIN and from the European Union delegation. Thank you, Thiago.
Thank you, Laura. As it seems, we actually don't have any specific question. So if no one wants to make a question right now, and due to the advanced time, because we had unfortunately some technical issues in the beginning, I would like to move on to the closing session, or the closing and keynote, who will be done by Mr. Carlos Oliveira, Minister Counselor and Head of EU Digital Market Sector. So, Mr. Carlos, feel free to speak, and so we can come to a conclusion of this very interesting event.
Well, good afternoon. I think that now is already good afternoon, certainly for the colleagues in Europe. And for us, it's almost good afternoon. We are 11:48. Well, my first words is actually to address you the thanks on behalf of Ambassador Ignacio Ibanez, that due to complex concourse of circumstances wasn't able to really join us as a speaker, but he definitely made very clear about his interest in, as representative of the EU, in being part of this discussion on one of the probably top issues that we have when discussing the cooperation between EU and Brazil, which is data protection. I'm not going to repeat the words that were made by my President's colleagues, especially Bruno Gencarelli, but this is certainly a topic that we have been working very intensively, not only with the Brazilian legislators, but also with the different ministries that are concerned by this topic, from Ministry of Science and Technology, Ministry of External Relations, Ministry of Economy. So it's very good to see that there is a real interest in really sharing experiences and sharing knowledge about this matter. So on behalf of Ambassador Ibanez, many thanks to all the participants for this. I'm not going to, let's say, go through all the points that were mentioned before, but perhaps one of the things that I would like to highlight is that when we discuss these matters, we are not only talking about an important civilizational value, as it was stated by my colleague Bruno Gencarelli, and also by the colleagues from Brazil, Miriam Wimmer and Laura Schertel, notably, but we are also looking at the aspects of the economic impact that this might have in the context of the developments of digital economy. As it was already very well stated by many people, data is the engine of the digital economy. It's what it makes it work. And a very key essential element is that we have to trust that our data are not really mishandled and misused. And people tend to focus very much on an important thing, which is, oh, I don't want to receive so many spam or emails about lots of things. But there is a very important thing that is now becoming also an important aspect of concern, is the fact that actually the cases of misappropriation of digital identities are increasing dramatically. So it's also a matter of safeguarding is also a cybersecurity matter in many respects, to make sure that actually our personal data is properly taken care by all the people that are dealing with it, ourselves in first place, but also our interlocutors in companies, in public bodies, and so on. I mean, from all the points that were brought up, there is one thing that perhaps I would like to just briefly mention as a point that could be even a point of departure for future discussions, which is the fact that, as very rightly stated by Carmela, I mean, we're talking about Switzerland, but Switzerland actually is surrounded by European countries. And in many cases, you have cities or towns that actually, you don't know where is the border almost. You cross the street and suddenly you realize that you move from Switzerland to Italy or vice versa, or France or Germany for that matter. And therefore, one of the things that is being very much discussed also is the issues of interoperability of these applications and the sharing of information. And of course, all the other aspects that were mentioned about making sure that this sharing of information takes place over a period that actually is relevant for the objective in discussion, and is not really becoming, let's say, an entry point to make this information then widely accessible, even for purposes that are not the ones that were intended originally, is also very important. Victoria and Gwendal also alluded to this point. So with this kind of summary, I would like to address to all the people that kindly joined for this discussion my thanks. Thank also their interest, and we look forward to actually meeting you again in the forthcoming event, perhaps probing even further some of these issues of the developments of digital economy, data protection, data economy, which are very central for the development of our future beyond the COVID times. Many thanks to all of you, and let me also reiterate my thanks to the organizing team, to Lapin, to my colleague Telis Bazira, to my colleague Noelia Barroso, and of course to the distinguished speakers that kindly gave the contribution to make this event possible. Many thanks to all. Many thanks to those that joined us during the meeting.